Welcome to our webinar on timely topics in regional economic development, brought to you by CFAIR. That's the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics. My name is Jane Kolodinsky, and I'm the CFAIR Program Chair. It's my pleasure to be moderating today's webinar. Next slide. It's CFAIR's mission to translate high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. When we demonstrate the value of the profession to these groups, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in agricultural and applied economics. Before we get started, I just want to provide some background on today's topic. This September CFAIR webinar highlights award-winning research and extension outreach on timely regional economic development issues. Presentations include an analysis of willingness to pay for broadband services, a study on the relationship between educational attainment and poverty across 7 southern states, and results from the Economic Opportunity Mapping, that's the EOM project, which enables communities to explore county-level business opportunities across industries. Each of these presentations received the George Goldman Award for Excellence in Regional Economic Development from the Community and Regional Economics Network of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association. CFAIR has assembled a panel of experts to discuss their work. We'll start with Mackenzie Boyce. Mackenzie Boyce is a PhD candidate in agricultural and applied economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She holds an MS in agricultural economics from Mississippi State University and a BS in agribusiness and agricultural communications from Oklahoma State University. She will join the Department of Agricultural Economics at Oklahoma State University in January as an assistant professor of community and rural development. Her primary research interest is quality of life, aiming to better understand the dynamics contributing to thriving rural areas. Dr. Anders Van Sant is an assistant professor of rural economic development in the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics at Colorado State University. He received his BA from Linfield University, a PhD from Colorado State University, and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Texas A&M University before serving as an assistant professor of regional economics at the University of Wyoming. His research and extension work focuses on strengthening rural economies through rural-urban linkages, industry diversification, entrepreneurship, and community interdependencies. Brian Whitaker is a professor and the Jean and Patsy Neustadt Chair in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Oklahoma State University. He received his PhD from Virginia Tech. Brian's main area of interest is rural economic development with a focus on the role that technology can play. He's published over 80 peer-reviewed journal articles, with many exploring the relationship between internet access and rural development. He's developed innovative outreach programs that help small towns benefit from the internet. Brian has won regional and national awards for his research, teaching, and extension programs. Dr. Whitaker also serves as the chair of Oklahoma's Broadband Expansion Council. Before I hand things over to our panelists, I'd like to remind you that you can submit questions for the speakers in the chat box at any time. We'll hold a Q&A session at the end of the presentation where our panelists will address your questions. So now I'll hand the webinar over to Mackenzie, who will start us off. Welcome, Mackenzie.
Thank you for that introduction. As Jane said, I'm Mackenzie Boyce, and today I will be presenting a report that I did with the UW-Madison Extension on willingness to pay for broadband internet using Wisconsin as a case study. Next slide, please. This project came about after a lot of discussions with communities across the state on Historic investments towards expanding broadband infrastructure were coming in, and questions about how to best navigate this funding in order to improve broadband access and adoption within the state. So over $1 billion came from the Broadband Equity Access and Development Program, $40 million in American Rescue Plan Act funding, and $129 million allocated in the state budget towards state broadband expansion grants. So a lot of investment in expanding this infrastructure, but still questions arose about what to do with this funding in order to improve broadband access and adoption. So this led to our research team asking the question of, if Wisconsin is successful in building out broadband infrastructure, will households be willing and able to pay the cost of a subscription? The infrastructure is one component, but the other piece of the puzzle is that cost component in order to actually get households connected to this broadband technology. Next slide, please. So in 2022, we conducted the Wisconsin Broadband Survey with the main goal of identifying how much households in Wisconsin are willing to pay for broadband, because ultimately the limits of what Wisconsin residents are willing and able to pay will affect the extent to which broadband expansion is successful. So this was a random sample mail survey that consisted of two parts. The first being collecting household demographics, assessing the current landscape of broadband in households in the state, and assessing their support for expanding broadband access. And then the second part of the survey was the main part, which consisted of a conjoint or discrete choice analysis experiment to actually determine this willingness to pay. The survey had a 17.5% response rate. About 700 responses were collected, with the caveat of the final sample being skewed towards older, retired, and more highly educated individuals. Next slide, please. So just to give you an example of what this choice set or discrete choice experiment looked like, which was used to determine willingness to pay for broadband, each survey consisted of 8 choice questions. This is an example of just one of those questions, where households were given the option to either select to purchase either option A, B, or C, 3 different alternative broadband packages available to them, or the option to not purchase home internet at all. And respondents selected one of these options, making trade-offs between the speed of the service, the download speed, the reliability of that service, the frequency of outages, and the cost. So based on respondents' selections within each of these choice questions, we were then able to use statistical analysis to determine their actual willingness to pay for that broadband service based on these trade-offs that they were making between broadband attributes. Next slide, please. So the first thing that we considered was their willingness to pay for speed, and we broke this out by income group because households are obviously faced a budget constraint. Their household income likely determines how much they're able to pay for these broadband services. So we looked at it by household income group to determine how much different households are willing to pay for broadband speed. So in this figure on the y-axis is the price per month of the broadband service, and on the x-axis, the download speed of that service that they would be purchasing. The gray bar represents the lowest household income group, those households with an income of less than $35,000 per year, and the red bar represents the highest income group, those making over $150,000 per year, or a combined household income over $150,000. So the first thing that we can see from this figure are that higher income households are willing to pay more for broadband speed than lower income households, likely due to that budget constraint that they face. But the other takeaway here is that households are willing to pay more for speed. For example, they're willing to pay more for 50 megabits per second relative to that 25 megabits per second, but their willingness to pay for speed only goes up to a certain point, after which is likely the result of household needs or demand for what they're doing on the internet being met at a certain speed. So for example, at 200 megabits per second, we see that the highest income group is willing to pay about $350 per month for 200 megabits per second of service. But then it drops down when their willingness to pay declines for 300 megabits per second, meaning that they aren't necessarily willing to pay more to go from 200 to 300 megabits per second. Next slide, please. The next thing that we looked at was willingness to pay for rare outages by income group or for reliability. And we can see that all households, regardless of income, are willing to pay more for greater reliability of services, fewer outages. But how much they're willing to pay is dependent upon their income. The lower income households are willing to pay less for this reliability than the higher income households, again, likely because of that different budget constraint these households face. Next slide, please. So just to kind of conclude with some takeaways and implications of this willingness to pay study in Wisconsin, the results really indicate, or the kind of message that we're trying to portray through this research is that while physical infrastructure is necessary to bring broadband to people's homes, the services must be available at a price that residents can afford and are willing to pay in order to improve broadband adoption and access in a state. We also find that households are willing to pay more than previous studies have found. Their willingness to pay for broadband services is higher than what a few other studies have found. And we also find that consumers are willing to pay more for speed than greater reliability. But the value that consumers place on speed is diminishing. They're willing to pay more for speed, but only up to a certain point. Our results suggest that speeds up to 100 megabits per second may be satisfactory for many households in the state. 100 megabits per second is also the current definition of broadband, whereas at the time of this survey, it was only 25 megabits per second. The other thing I wanted to point out is that there is a noticeable gap among low and high income households' willingness to pay for broadband, which is something that communities should consider. Communities should consider the income levels of their residents when making expansion decisions. Depending on how much households are able to pay for broadband may determine how successful broadband expansion is in that, or adoption is in that area. And communities may need to seek out additional funding mechanisms in order to close that gap if the price of providing broadband service is higher than what households in that area are willing or able to pay. If the goal is equitable adoption and expansion, communities may have to find a way to close that gap in order to allow households to connect in their area. Next slide, please. And that concludes my presentation for today. I'm happy to answer any additional questions about this report at the end of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Mackenzie. So audience, don't forget to write those questions into that chat box. Next, we'll be hearing from Anders. Welcome, Anders.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you all for having me. I'm very excited to be here with you today. I am Dr. Anders Van Sant with Colorado State University in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics. And the principal investigator of this project is actually Dr. Craig Carpenter with Michigan State University, who couldn't be here today. I'm going to be sharing with you today some insights from a project that we recently worked on called Mapping Economic Opportunity in Rural America. So over the past few decades, when driving through rural towns, you might have seen an increasing number of main streets that look more like the left side of this image. Buildings in disrepair, poor city amenities, empty storefronts, and just general economic depression. For decades, we've seen young people leaving these rural communities for urban opportunities. So what we would like to do is intentionally reverse this trend to support rural economies and the products and services that they uniquely provide, such as agriculture, food, natural resources, mining, manufacturing, outdoor recreation. It goes on. Just recently, we have seen a reverse in this trend of youth outmigration. So there is some hope that our collective efforts are having an effect. But regardless of this progress, rural America is changing fast along with the rest of the world. And local leaders often don't have the data they need to make informed decisions. So with federal support, my team was able to dig into restricted access data sets and build tools that give communities a clear picture of their opportunities and risks. Next slide, please. So here is the project team. It includes Dr. Craig Carpenter, Rebecca Dudensing, and myself, who were all at Texas A&M at the time. Scott Leverage at Michigan State and Linda Neem at Iowa State, and this is an interdisciplinary team to try to get as many perspectives as possible to further enhance our research and our findings. Our goals were to use restricted access data to get more accurate measures of rural businesses, and that would enable us to identify which industries can thrive in small markets, what potential barriers might be, what potential opportunities might be, and what types of businesses might be more vulnerable in these communities. And then finally, we sought to share our results in accessible ways, including an online mapping tool to disseminate our research widely. And I would just like to thank the Agricultural and Food Research Initiative Competitive Program of the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture for funding this award. Next, please. In order to produce meaningful research for rural decision makers, we sandwiched the research portion of this project with community engagement through extension on both sides. So we started with stakeholder listening sessions, and we developed a detailed analysis of restricted access data. And then we prepared academic research articles. I think we've published 11 to date. And finally, we developed an interactive mapping tool for stakeholders to again, translate that research into something more meaningful for those decision makers. To go over all of the findings from these 11 research articles would exhaust my time very quickly here, so I'll just go over some of the highlights and the findings that we had. Business survival thresholds. Some industries like grocery stores or gas stations can operate in these small markets, while others such as hospitals might require larger populations. And indeed, we are seeing hospitals close at alarming rates in rural communities across the United States. Local banks and resilience. Rural counties with more community banks saw stronger small business formation and stability. And so this emphasizes the role of local banks and their importance in local economies. Although I will also note that franchise banks are important for the growth of franchise businesses due to their homogeneous lending practices, cutting down on uncertainty and transaction costs, which these franchise businesses, they would prefer just to have the same lending practices no matter where they enter a market to reduce those transaction costs. Data gaps. Public data often undercounts rural establishments due to suppression rules, which are there to protect our privacy. So it is important. But because of the smaller populations in rural places have a disproportionate number of their data cells that are suppressed or noise infused. And when you use this public data to then make public policy decisions, it leads to misleading policy. So that's why we use the restricted access data to get more finely nuanced information for our stakeholders. And finally, industry dynamics. So an example of this would be rural manufacturing and service sectors are shaped by infrastructure, natural assets, and clustering effects. Clustering effects are where one business might move into a market, and that actually makes it easier for another business to move in there, and they actually both do better at that point because of network effects or being able to cost share on equipment, something like that. So this project produced 11 academic research articles published in academic and practical outreach journals. It published in top field journals such as Journal of Regional Science and Health Economics, which actually, that second paper actually won Best Publication Award from the Health Economics section at the American Agricultural Economics Association. And then we gave 12 research presentations, over 29 extension presentations and focus groups across the nation. And it produced a postdoc, which is me. I'm now working in very similar fields, continuing to do research on this project. So it's important to note that this federal funding doesn't just produce research or meaningful results for communities, it also produces the next generation of researchers who are going to tackle these problems. Next slide, please. So this is the mapping tool. And so it allows you to, this is interactive, so you can zoom in on any county or state in the United States and hover over it to get more information. But the blue indicates above predicted. So that means that for whatever industry we're looking at, say this is hardware stores or hospitals or something, if it was above predicted, that means that we are seeing more establishments than we actually expect to see in that community. And so that might mean that that community is taking advantage of certain strengths and they're leveraging them well, and that would make a good case study for other communities to learn from them. or it might mean that that industry is becoming top heavy as the market is changing, and they might need to think about how to downsize that industry in thoughtful ways to reduce harm on the labor market. When we look at below predicted, it's just the opposite, where we expect to see more industries or more establishments within that industry in that county, but we, for some reason, see less. So that's a great opportunity for decision makers to go in there and identify what factors could be contributing to that, what barriers exist, and what opportunities exist for them to bring more of that more establishments of that industry into the community to maybe alleviate supply chain issues for related industries in the community. And then we also produce those industry support measures down there, which vary depending on the industry you're looking at, but they're just some variables that were particularly significant for that industry that enable decision makers at the county level to leverage a little more effectively. Next slide, please. So the outcomes from this grant, first, it developed insights that help communities plan strategically. So we use these restricted access data to reveal these rural nuances. And we found that communities should leverage social capital and place-based assets in particular. Social capital are the bonds that connect us all. It's how we work together or don't work together. It's how we tackle big problems, things like that. And then place-based assets could be things like national parks or a river or empty natural areas. And then some industries thrive in small markets and others need scale. And while this was already known, we developed more nuanced measures of this using restricted access data, so we weren't biased by the public data. So we're better information for decision makers. We also developed practical tools, including the mapping tool that you see here, which identified opportunities and risks at the county level. And then we hope that this does have a lasting impact, although the public data that's relied on went under further noise and fusion, which kind of made the tool less reliable. So we've moved on from that, but it still produced quite a few peer-reviewed publications and community guidance while it was up and running, and it shaped new projects, such as a project I have now looking at healthcare access in rural places. Next slide, please. So I would just like to quickly thank CFAIR and our federal partners for putting on this webinar and making this funding available to us. If you take away one thing from this, it's that federal investment in rural research doesn't just stay in academic journals. It directly helps communities understand their strengths, prepare for risks, and build more resilient economies. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. Fascinating results and discussion of your work. Our final panelist today is Brian Whitaker. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Jane. And again, I'll echo my appreciation for CFAIR for having this webinar. You guys always have great topics, and hopefully this one is of interest to a lot of people. Well, before I jump into mine, I just want to say a quick couple words of again appreciation for both Mackenzie and Anders. You guys are, frankly, have heard from some of the rising stars in the regional economics field. Mackenzie's work on broadband is close to my own heart. I've kind of made a career out of broadband, and so that's a super hot topic right now. And the work that she did analyzing what people are willing to pay is a hugely important step in the right direction for Wisconsin. I wish we had studies like this across the nation, frankly, that demonstrated this willingness to pay. It aligns with a lot of my own work, kind of showing that this adoption piece of broadband is more important than just the access piece. Getting people to productively use the internet, super critical. And then Anders, that was a super amazing presentation. I totally agree with your take-home point about the AFRI funding. You guys demonstrated, 11 articles out of a single AFRI grant is pretty amazing. And the extension side of things is incredible. You guys are doing, I've used that map myself. I know you said you went out and gave presentations on this. It really demonstrates the impact that a lot of the work that we're trying to do in the regional economics, rural community development field, not just from a research perspective, but getting people to, improve their quality of life, frankly, make important decisions that can affect not only themselves, but the communities around them. So really great stuff. For the audience, you guys, again, heard from two of our rising stars. Now you're stuck with the old guy in the group, and that's me. And I'm going to be talking about this paper that we just published this year. It came out in the Annals of Regional Science, and it's called The Shifting Relationship Between Educational Attainment and Poverty. Just a quick background on this, the lead author there, Amadio, he's now a postdoc at Mississippi State. This whole paper kind of arose from the class that I teach here at Oklahoma State on spatial econometrics. And so I assigned a group project during that class, and Amadio is one of the few that saw it through to publication. We've had a couple of those now, and frankly, it's a really cool story of how this thing came about. Alicia was also in that group project, and so I'll next slide. I'll kind of give you guys an overview of what we did here. So this builds on, again, like a lot of the presentations here today, a hot topic in our times. You can see some headlines here from the past couple years from the New York Times. You know, Americans are losing faith in the value of college. Why is that? That little graphic you see in the middle there was actually tied to that article. It shows that the expected benefit for a four-year college grad is really kind of shrinking over time. It used to be huge back in the 1940s, not so much anymore. You see it shrinking both for African-American households and also for white non-Hispanic households. You can see the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis had a paper on, is college still worth it? We've got some new calculus. Over on the right, you see a 2024 report from Pew, who does a lot of great interviews and surveys. And they had the same question, is college worth it? They kind of highlight this chart showing, if you look at the right-hand side of that chart, you can see if the young men without a college degree are actually doing better in the past 10 years. They've made some pretty important gains. And then just this month, the bottom left there, the newest face of long-term unemployment is the college educated. So it's kind of raises this question, is college still worth doing? And so that's what we kind of sought out to do, answer a pretty specific question, but along these lines. And so the next slide, please. So what we did was we did some kind of statistical techniques to look at the relationship, the changing relationship between different levels of education and the percentage of your population that's in poverty. And so I think a lot of people on this call are probably familiar with the American Community Survey data. And so to get low levels of geography on this data, we have to use kind of these 5-year averages, right? So our first period was this kind of early period from 2010 to 2014. And then we looked at kind of a later period, 2017 to 2021. And so our data is kind of averaged across those time periods. But again, the idea was we wanted to look at shifts that happened across this kind of broader decade. We did gather this information at the census tract level. For those of you not familiar with the census tract, I've got some maps in the next couple of slides, but it's basically an area of about 4,000 people. So in a very urban place, those are going to be tiny, right? A really metropolitan area is going to have a small census tract, but more rural locations are going to be a lot more land mass. And so you'll see some of that in the maps that follow. And so we really focused on what we call the Deep South states. So you can see there, I think we have 7 states: Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, and South Carolina. And the rationale for that is these are widely recognized as having relatively high levels of poverty. And so we wanted to see in these places that are, kind of dealing with this question, this issue of kind of continued poverty, do changes in what people are doing education-wise, if they're gaining more associate's degrees, if they're, having more people graduate from college or fewer, what is that going to do to the poverty rate in those areas? And kind of the neat little thing about our paper is we use some pretty recent advances in, again, spatial econometrics, which I know is not going to be everyone's cup of tea on this call, so I'll try to keep it pretty simple. But I think it's pretty cool that what we ended up doing and kind of how we demonstrated that with some maps, which I think are very useful. So next slide, please. So here's the fun statistical stuff. I love a good equation. Hopefully some people on this webinar do also. So here's the data, the kind of takeaway data from our 2 time periods. If you look at the table on the top left there, you can see that we actually saw a reduction in the percentage of people that just got a high school degree. Okay, so it stopped at, it was 28.9% in that earlier period. dropped to 27.8% in the lower period. You can look across the other two. The two below that are the ones we're really interested in. More people are getting associate's degrees, and the question was, is that leading to a reduction in poverty? We also see an increase in the percentage of people getting a bachelor's degree. Is that associated with poverty, and to what extent are these kind of associated with these changes in poverty? We didn't focus as much on graduate degrees, but you do see some shifts there as well. And then if you look at the levels of poverty, it is true we generally saw a reduction in poverty over that time frame. And so it dropped all the way from 19.3% to 15.5%. The reasons for that, if you think about back to the Great Recession, we were still recovering from that in this 2010 to 14 period. And so that's kind of the main reason I would argue is finally recovering from the Great Recession is the main reason for these reductions in poverty over time. The maps on the right is again something that's really cool. We were using our regional economics tools to demonstrate something, and this is just the percentage of people that had associate's degrees. And you can see the percentage there in the legends. The top is the earlier period, the bottom is the lower period, and you can really see there was an increase in how many people were getting associate's degrees during this time. You can see particularly in Mississippi and parts of Texas, we really see pretty pronounced increases in the percentage of people that are getting associate's degrees. And so again, the question is, does that lead to reductions in poverty? So that's kind of what we're trying to answer. If you look over at our traditional approach equation, this is what we're trying to model, right? These levels of poverty, how are they affected by education? We know there's other things that also affect poverty, things like the industrial structure, what industries people work in. The local unemployment rate is certainly going to be an important part of that. And then we've got demographic characteristics that we try to control for too, right? Family composition, percentage of single mothers is always an important thing to look at, racial and ethnic composition, and also commuting patterns. How far are people driving for work? So we control for these. And the problem with this traditional approach is it only gives a single parameter. Like we only get one number to estimate how much an associate's degree affects poverty, right? And so we try to take a step beyond that in this paper that we did, but we use something called a multi-scale geographically weighted regression. That's what MGWR stands for. And the difference there, I kind of highlight it here, each census tract is allowed to have its own parameter. That little I means every single tract that we had in our analysis is allowed to vary. The number can change, the significance can change. And so that's kind of what's neat about what we did to try to demonstrate that there are shifting relationships in this kind of relationship between education and poverty, and that they have changed over time. We can actually map those out. So again, the right-hand side there says we model this both for the earlier time period and then for the later time period. And the takeaway hopefully will become apparent in the next slide. So these are the results. In the next slide, please. So let's focus first here on the left-hand side. These are only what you see here are only the areas that have statistically significant coefficients. And for the most part, they're all negative. They are all negative. So in that earlier time period, if you look at how many tracts had a negative relationship between associate degree and poverty, you can see there are lots of pockets there, right? And in particular, I'd call your attention to, if you look at Texas, those very urban areas, you can kind of pinpoint Dallas, you can pinpoint San Antonio if you're pretty good with geography. You can see those are all red, and so they're all having negative relationships. So more associate's degrees means fewer people in poverty. Same thing there in Georgia. If you look at Atlanta, you can see a pocket there. Again, a good chunk of these tracts have a negative relationship between the percentage with an associate's degree and poverty. And that's kind of what we expected. But then when you look at the later period, it kind of goes away, right? There's not as many pockets, and a lot of those urban areas lose that significance. And so this was a little surprising. We don't see as strong relationship between associate's degrees and reductions in poverty in this later period. Okay, and so that's kind of what our takeaway message there. The opposite of that is true if you look at bachelor's degrees. So again, that top period, again, there's more covered with red here, that makes sense because we expect the higher percentage of people with bachelor's degrees should be closely associated with a reduction in poverty. And so we see that, we see basically a larger swath of red in the bottom portion there, right? So a bigger chunk of the census tracts demonstrate this negative relationship for bachelor's degrees over time. And then one more slide for me, kind of to wrap things up. So we basically see this reduction in the importance of associate's degrees for affecting poverty. Again, that top bullet there, the associate's degree was significantly negative for about half of all tracts in that earlier time period, but only about a fifth in the later time period. So it's not, it doesn't appear to be as influential in reducing poverty over time. The opposite is seen for a bachelor's degree. It was about half of tracts in the earlier time period, and that jumps up to 63% in the later time period. Another thing that we do in the paper is kind of look at how the bandwidth of these coefficients, and if it's what we call a local coefficient or a more global coefficient. And the takeaway is that bachelor's degree seems to be becoming more global in nature. So that means it's more widely relevant and more widely accepted. Another cool takeaway from this analysis that we did is that the importance of a single mother was kind of reduced over time. And that, if you can see the statistics there, the percentage of single mothers was significantly positively related to poverty for a really high number, 76% of tracts in that earlier time period. Yeah, it goes down to 25% in the later time period. We argue that might be due to some changes that communities are making to try to help single mothers, maybe some local resources that can be helpful for those single mother households to potentially get them out of poverty. And again, the kind of takeaway messages here on the right, bachelor's degrees seem to be increasing in importance for this area. And then again, the policy takeaways we argue for in the paper, we really try to focus on these 4-year degrees. You can kind of look at the map and see where this influence has increased over time. And then we argue that these region-specific policies, you can kind of look into the maps and argue that where we can kind of focus on local economic conditions and educational needs, in particular partnerships between universities and industries that might pop up. So that's it for me. Happy to take questions. We've had really great presentations and look forward to seeing what you guys come up with.